Hey family, and anybody else watching, and welcome back to As For Me and My House. Genesis 37, 38, and 39 today. This one goes out to Dad and Ida, and we have been following Jacob, and we've been following his family line. Now, we looked yesterday at Jacob's daughter Dinah and the Shechemites, some deceit going on there, some absolutely terrible stuff going on there. We saw, beyond that, Jacob returning to Bethel, the deaths of Isaac and Rachel, and then we took a look at the descendants of Esau. Now, today we're picking up with Joseph. So, continuing down the family line today with Joseph, we'll see his dreams, his interactions with his brothers, because of those interactions with his brothers being sold into slavery. And then beyond that, we'll look at Judah and Tamar, and then Joseph and Potiphar's wife. And we'll talk about that because there's a couple different things going on at play that, I don't know, it's such an easy narrative story that it's really easy to just kind of read, understand it, and move on. And I think there's a couple things that, as it relates to obviously you, Dad, but also to Ida, as far as what lessons I can take from that now as a father that I've learned from you, Dad, and also from you, Ida. So we'll talk about that briefly. But Genesis 37, 38, and 39. So, 37. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah, and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made a richly ornamented robe for him. When his brothers saw their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him, and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to the dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to rule over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Now, his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, "As you know, your brothers are grazing your flocks near Shechem. Come, I'm going to send you to them." "Very well," he replied. So he said to him, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers, and with the flocks, and bring word back to me." Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields, and asked him, "What are you looking for?" He replied, "I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks?" "They've moved on from here," the man answered. "I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went with his brother after his brothers, and found them near Dothan. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill him, then throw him into one of these cisterns, and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the desert, but don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So, when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the richly ornamented robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. Now the cistern was empty. There was no water in it. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled up Joseph out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornamented robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. No, he said, in mourning I will go down to the grave to my son. So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Chapter 38. At that time, Judah left his brothers and went down to stay with a man of Adullam named Hirah. There, Judah met the daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua. He married her and lay with her. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son, who was named She conceived again and gave birth to a son, and named him Onan. She gave birth to still another, and named him Shelah. It was at Kezib that she gave birth to him. Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, lie with your brother's wife, and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to produce offspring for your brother. But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, so whenever he lay with his brother's wife, he spilled his semen on the ground to keep from producing offspring for his brother. What he did was wicked in the Lord's sight, so he put him to death also. Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, live as a widow in your father's house until my son Selah grows up. For he thought he may die too, just like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. After a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. When Judah had recovered from his grief, he went up to Timnah, to the men who were shearing his sheep, and his friend Hirah, the Adullamite, went with him. When Tamar was told, your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep, she took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then sat down at the entrance to Anim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that though Shelah had now grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. When Judah saw her, he thought that she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, come now, let me sleep with you. And what will you give me to sleep with you? She asked. I'll send you a young goat from my flock, he said. Will you give me something as pledge until you send it? She said. He said, what shall I pledge to give you? Your seal and its cord, and the staff in your hand, she answered. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. After she left, she took off her veil and put on her widow's clothes again. Meanwhile, Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adullamite in order to get his pledge back from the woman, but he did not find her. He asked the men who were there, where is the shrine prostitute who is beside the road at Anim? There hasn't been any shrine prostitute, they said. Any shrine prostitute here, they said. So he went back to Judah and said, I didn't find her. Besides, the men who lived there said there hasn't been any shrine prostitute here. Then Judah said, let her keep what she has, or we will become a laughingstock. After all, I did send her this young goat, but you didn't find her. About 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law, Tamar, is guilty of prostitution, and as a result, she's now pregnant. Judah said, bring her out and have her burned to death. As she was brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. I'm pregnant by the man who owns these, she said, and she added, see if you can recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are. Judah recognized them and said, she is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Selah, and he did not sleep with her again. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her room. As she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand so that the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it on his wrist and said, this one came out first. But when he drew back his hand, his brother came out. And she said, so this is how you have broken out. And he was named Perez. Then his brother, who had the scarlet thread on his wrist, came out, and he was given the name Zerah. Chapter 39. Now, Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything that he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So he left in Joseph's care everything that he had. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now, Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns has been entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. One day, he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he had left the cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. And when he heard me scream for help, he left this cloak beside me and ran out of the house." She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story. "That Hebrew slave you brought to us had came to me to make sport of me, but as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." When his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me." He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden, so that the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. One of the things I love about that story right there is when Joseph is talking to Potiphar's wife in verse 8 through 10. But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in his house. Everything he owns has been entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" So I guess I'll stop there. So through verse 9. So he's recognizing that Potiphar has allowed him to do all this. And in reality, yeah, we know it's God. But he's recognizing that Potiphar has given him all charge of everything. And yet what he says there in 9, how could I do such a wicked thing and sin against Potiphar? No. It's how could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? Yeah, Potiphar has maybe done all this stuff, but really, truly, ultimately, how could I stand before my God? And that is absolutely awesome. I think that's super cool. But one thing that I thought was really interesting, and I hadn't thought explicitly about this before, and maybe it's having people to I don't know, to dedicate or to read this kind of for, but I thought this was really interesting because there are a couple aspects of the story that Dad, you taught me as and teach me as a parent, and Ida, that I learned from you as a parent as well, and seeing this, and that is Dad, discernment. And that's something that discernment and that decision making in the moment is something that is, good grief, I admire you for it. And it's something that I'll be honest, I'm struggling with as a father. It's so easy to get, as I'm speaking right now, Kinsey is crying and I think Rayleigh's crying. And having that discernment to pause and to respond to that crying and not just react, not just to tell Rayleigh you should have been in bed a half hour ago or whatever, and not to be frustrated with Kinsey because, I've gone through my checklist of, hey, I've changed you, I've fed you, you should be well rested, and then get angry because of it. But having that discernment in the moment to pause and make the right action. So yeah, we see that with Joseph and Potiphar's wife, but I saw that constantly with you and us growing up, and good grief, if I emulate that even a quarter as well as you do, then I will count myself very, very blessed. Something that I'm absolutely actively praying for. Ida, the decision that Potiphar, or that Joseph makes there with Potiphar's wife isn't man, thank you, Potiphar's wife. That is really gracious. Wow, you know what? I'm flattered. No, I'm not going to do that, but wow, that was really, no, he just runs. He just gets out of there. He acts with that absolute decisiveness, that quick conviction with which he gets out of the house. is what I see in you. That decisiveness of, why would you do that? Do this. Don't do that. Do this. And it's that quick decisiveness that is, I know it comes naturally to you. And I'm hoping that that's a skill that I can foster more as well, because I don't naturally have that. But I think that that's something that can be so, so valuable. So thank you both for displaying that. It means so much more than you know. And I think it means more than you know because you both show it so naturally. Worth praying about. So let's do it. My God, I thank you so much for my father and for Ida and for that decisiveness, Lord, and for that discernment. My God, I know that not everyone has that. So I thank you for both of them, that they have shown that to both me and to my brothers. And because of that, that they've shown that to the next generation, Lord. My God, I pray that you strengthen them, that you allow them to continue in that, Lord, and continue to be even stronger and stronger, Lord, that whoever they come across gets to see that aspect of them, but also even further looks to you for some of those godly traits, Lord. Again, I thank you so, so much for them. And in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Well, Dad, Ida, good grief. Love you tons. And know that I appreciate you so much. For anyone else watching, as always, know that I appreciate you as well. And I will plan on seeing you tomorrow. Have a good one.